back here on the Metal Command podcast. Tony here with you. Let's talk about the album that ended up getting me into death metal. And that is the album Symbolic by the band Death, which came out back in 1995. And folks, up until this point, I was really not a big fan of death metal. I loved thrash. I loved all the Bay Area stuff. I loved old Metallica. I loved Exodus, Death Angel, all of those bands. I absolutely loved that kind of music. But death metal for me was really something that I just really couldn't get into back then. Now, to be honest, I was a teenager. I was young. I was really kind of sort of getting into this music back then at this point. But I remember when this album came out, and I remember friends of mine talking about how insanely awesome the actual album is. And I thought to myself, you know what? I'm going to go out. I'm going to go look for this record. And I went out and bought it, probably a couple months after it came out. And I looked in a bargain bin, for like $2. They had a copy of Individual Thought Patterns. And I thought to myself, you know what? Let's take a chance on both of these albums. Now, keep in mind, this is before streaming. You didn't have high-speed internet back then. I mean, the internet was kind of in its infancy at that point. So I had no real way to check out what this band sounded like unless I was listening to them with somebody, which I didn't really have that opportunity. So I went out and took a chance and spent $12 on the new Death album. And this is the record that ended up getting me into death metal. And this is where I realized that Chuck Schuldiner was an absolute genius of a songwriter. Because this was unlike any other death metal album I had ever heard. Now, I had heard bands like Obituary, Cannibal Corpse. Obituary I like better now than I did back when I was a teenager, for sure. But I couldn't really get into like bands like Cannibal Corpse or anything like that. But Death was a completely different kind of band. And it opened me up to get into other death metal bands like At the Gates. And then later on, obviously, bands like Soilwork and bands like that. But man, the album Symbolic, to me, is one of the most incredible death metal albums ever written. A lot of progressive elements that were kind of ahead of their time at that point. I had listened, and then when I going back and listening to the discography, Death's discography, obviously you can see them kind of working up to this point. I love Individual Thought Patterns. I love Leprosy. I love the album Human. But generally speaking, Symbolic was it. Like, that was like, man. Hearing songs like Crystal Mountain, for example, probably my favorite song off of the album. But this was an album where it really changed my perception of death metal as a genre. Do I predominantly listen to it a lot? No. But it opened me up to find a lot of other great bands, death metal bands out there that I do enjoy and that I decided to explore because of the album Symbolic. It's interesting too, because 3 years later, was it 3 years later? I like to say 3 years later, maybe 4. I don't remember what I don't remember exactly, but I ended up going to see Death play a show down at the old Peabody's here in Cleveland, which was in the Flats, if you're familiar with the Cleveland area. And Hammerfall opened up for them. And I ended up going down. It was when The Sound of Perseverance came out. I ended up I got to meet Chuck Schuldiner, who was a really freaking cool guy. I interviewed him in person, actually. And then I got to meet the guys in Hammerfall. I believe the Legacy of Kings album, their second album, was out back then. But Chuck was an incredibly cool dude. He came on my radio show, and then I got to meet him and interview him in person. And then I ended up getting to meet Oscar and Joachim from Hammerfall back then as well. But it was an interesting tour because you had this resurgent like old school style power metal band, traditional metal band in Hammerfall, playing and opening for the band Death. But the reception to the show was very, very good. I believe in Cleveland there was a local band called Medieval that ended up opening up for them. But that show was great. And it's the only time I ever saw Death perform. Chuck obviously passed away, after that, not right after that, but he eventually passed away. But man, if there's an album that changed my perception of death metal as a subgenre, it's Symbolic. Because I just think it's a genius. It's a genius album. It really is. It's very melodic. It has a lot of great tracks on it, but Crystal Mountain is my favorite one. The other thing is the reason I'm bringing this album up is that it just came out on vinyl again. Now my son, this is one of his favorite bands, and I ended up picking up a copy of this for him on vinyl. And I should have picked one up. And this album had been out of print on vinyl for a long time. I mean, there were people selling them on eBay for like $600, $200. I think the Amazon Marketplace had one for like $780, something absurd. But then they came out with it on vinyl recently, like not long ago. I think early May 2025 is when it came out. I should have bought myself a copy, because no sooner did they ship out all the pre-orders, it was out of stock. A lot of people love this record. Most people that I know say this is the best album Death ever did. I am in agreement with that. I love Individual Thought Patterns. I think The Sound of Perseverance is a good record as well. But this is the album that ended up getting me into death metal. So, folks, if you're into this band and you're into this album, where do you rank it in Death's discography? Do you like this album? Do you dislike this album? Share your opinion. I'm curious what all of you think, because I think this album is fantastic. Hey everybody, Tony here from the Metal Command podcast. Again, I appreciate your support. Since 1998, I have hosted this show in one form or another, starting off in radio and now in the podcast format. Again, thanks for watching, and if you like what you see and hear on this show, by all means, please hit the subscribe button, hit the little bell to be notified anytime I do post a video, and if you see this program on any other form of social media, please give me a follow there. Again, I always appreciate your support.